Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. Today I'm joined by Matt Hoyt to discuss the first entry in the Blackwell Companion Natural Theology, the entry on the PSR, written by Alexander Pruss. So, yeah, Matt, you had a lot of things you wanted to say about that, so I'll let you get started.
All right, thank you very much. So the first thing I wanted to say, or where I wanted to start really, is Inwagen's argument. The first thing that seems strange to me is how, out of all the premises in the Inwagen argument, only the PSR is assumed by reductio, and that's basically what's trying to be contradicted in the proof. But it seems to me that there are really three things, all taken together as basic assumptions. And what Inwagen's argument on page 50 shows is that all three of them together are resulting in problems. And so I want to take a look at each of those three and basically clarify the discussion to see who might have problems with what. So the first one is the one that Pruss himself takes issue with, is the first assumption that no necessary fact can explain a contingent proposition. The thing which Inwagen assumed by reductio is the PSR. And the last one is the existence of the BCCF itself, the big contingent conjunctive fact, or maybe I got those backwards, right? So let's go over each of these three real quickly. The first one, naturalists, I think, would want to assume, like Inwagen, it might be a little strong, but I don't think they need to assume no necessary fact can explain all contingent propositions. I think, unlike how Pruss discusses it, I think they might be justified in thinking of this assumption for scientific facts or maybe libertarian facts. So, for example, you don't want a necessary fact attempting to explain why somebody made a choice, because that would seem to undermine, the libertarian free will associated with this choice. If some necessary thing says they're going to do what they're going to do. So that I think everybody might have a problem with. Scientific facts, for example, are hard to explain by necessary propositions because they're unfalsifiable. I don't mean that in the strictly positivist sense, like Ayer or that type of thing. What I mean is, there's a section that Pruss himself talks about in the article where he talks about what is it, inference is best explanation or something like that, where what he talks about is the Sherlock Holmes idea, where you see this cool thing you want to talk about. You have all sorts of likely candidates for what might explain why this thing occurred. And what you do is you start using data and other tools at your disposal to start knocking off the explanations until you get to the most likely one. And maybe you'll make a discovery that, adds more to the list, and you have to come back to it over time. And that's kind of how science works. But the problem is, if you allow any necessary proposition to explain the contingent fact you're talking about, it's logically possible you could add two of them. And if I say have two possible differing necessary explanations for a scientific fact, there's no way I can use that level of explanation to boil it down to any one of them. So I'm not necessarily taking their position, but I can see why they might want a certain version of the assumption. So a way I weakened it is that I decided, well, okay, maybe we can change it to, if an explanation is a necessary proposition, then the explanation must be conceptual, right? Because Pruss himself talked about three types of explanations in the article. You have scientific, agential, and conceptual. And I think we can maybe agree that the latter two aren't very good candidates for necessary types of explanations, which leaves a third. So that's a weaker version maybe of the first axiom that I think maybe people might be happier with. As for the principle of sufficient reason, that's basically the crux of the argument itself proper in the article, the idea that every contingent fact has an explanation. And this is what Pruss ultimately uses to prove God's existence in this Leibnizian style argument. Pruss, I think, does a really, really good job of explaining why it is that we should probably take the PSR as a properly basic belief. Without it, it makes no sense, for example, to talk about the scientific method. What sense does it make to repeat something over and over and over again, expecting similar, testable, repeatable results, if the thing you're testing in question might not even have a single explanation, right? The thing that causes the thing you're trying to do the experiment on might change, or might be random, or might be, whatever. So all of science basically crumbles if you don't have a fixed reason for something happening, which you can kind of derive through repeated experimentation and testing. So the last thing that seems to be, at odds is the BCCF, this big contingent conjunction factor, or, something of that nature. And that's basically this idea that you can take every possible contingent fact and shove it together in a single conjunction, and note that this conjunction itself must be contingent and therefore requires an explanation by the PSR, which I think we should agree is a thing. Now, the problem with the BCCF is its abstraction. So Pruss has a whole section where he talks about possible objections to the BCCF. The first one is there's this slick Russellian style argument where you can end up getting at something that is and is not in the BCCF, which is one of the dangers mathematicians have quickly figured out of talking about any set of for all anything. Because if you don't properly rein your sets in and talk about exactly what you want and nothing else, there's all kinds of things that can creep in. Now, Pruss tries to address this when he makes up the new BCCF. Let me see if I can find the section here real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Here it is. So page 80, right? Page 80, he defines what he calls a BCCF star. Now, if you look at this thing, what's really tough about it is it's also abstract. It's hard to decipher exactly what propositions are left once you look at all true contingent atomic propositions and start chipping away at them with his other caveats. It's really difficult to say what's there and what's not there. So as an illustration, there's a famous example of a mathematician that went to a conference. He said, I'm gonna make this cool set, and I'm gonna prove all these things about this cool set. And it turns out that once he made a set and all these cool properties, and went to like a 2-hour presentation proving all these cool properties his set had, he said, "Are there any questions?" And a member of the audience stands up and says, "This was a really great presentation about the empty set." And so everybody thought about it for a second. It turned out that once you add too many properties that a set has to hold, you run a risk of the only set satisfying all of them being the empty set. Now, I'm not accusing him of doing that here. I don't know enough about exactly what's in this thing to say that this what he did. But in a more general sense, I don't know that his BCCF star grabs all the propositions he wants to explain necessarily and leaves out all the ones he doesn't. I don't know if it's exhaustive enough, given how abstract it and its little corollaries are. So the BCCF itself might be another issue. So those are three things basically that bring Inwagen's argument into question. So I mean, that's basically the foundation for my curiosity with this article. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, okay. So like you said, there's the three premises. No necessary fact can explain a contingent proposition, the PSR, and the existence of the BCCF. Now, the premise one, it sounds similar to the objection that Hume makes, the problem that Hume points out in the problem of induction. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The problem is how to support or justify them, and it leads to a dilemma. The principle cannot be proved deductively, for it is contingent, and only necessary truths can be proven deductively. And then, nor can it be supported inductively, because that'd be circular reasoning. But it seems like the Humean objection here is that only deduction can prove necessary truths, and you cannot deductively prove contingent truths, which seems to be a similar kind of acceptance of this principle, maybe stated somewhat differently. Though I don't see why there'd be any good reason to believe that no necessary fact can explain a contingent proposition. For instance, we could imagine a situation where we have one necessary fact that explains every contingent proposition. We could have an example of a necessary fact that explains some but not all contingent propositions. And I don't see why logic would dictate we should not take the weaker form.
Exactly.
Which basically Van Inwagen says he rejects both the strong and the weaker form of that. But I don't really see why the weaker form would fall afoul, because
exactly, yes.
So I would argue that it's just not, it's not properly basic. It's not something we should be compelled to accept. I agree with you with the PSR that if things can happen without an explanation. Really, what's interesting is you mentioned when Pruss was arguing in the book that if you don't accept the PSR as properly basic belief, then you can't explain scientific knowledge. It's kind of the opposite problem but leading to the opposite cause, but leading to the same problem that we had of not being able to explain something scientifically. If we had two necessary facts that explained an event, how could you rule out one over the other? Therefore, you couldn't give a scientific explanation. But if you deny the PSR, you also can't give a scientific explanation.
Exactly.
The other thing is, whether you have two or more necessary facts that explain all of reality, and you got to get back to this at the end of your little paper where you outline your thoughts. We'll get to that later. But Van Inwagen seems to think in premise one that, or rather not Van Inwagen, Pruss, in fleshing out Van Inwagen's objection, seems to indicate that there could be multiple necessary facts that explain more than one contingent proposition.
Right.
So what I would say is you could have the situation where you have more than one necessary fact that explains some but not all contingent propositions, or more than one necessary fact that explains some but not all. So yeah, they could either both explain the same one, or they could both explain multiple ones, or you could limit it and say, well, there's multiple independent necessary facts, but they don't explain the same thing. I mean, I don't see why that wouldn't be a possibility, logically speaking.
Right.
Again, it feels like there's too many logical possibilities that Van Inwagen is not taking into account and not giving reasons to believe should be the case. Because what he's really saying is very specific, that there are more than two or more necessary facts that explain one event. But there's a whole host of other ways you could structure necessary facts relating to contingent propositions that could be totally different from that construction.
Right.
The PSR, I think we both agree, is properly basic. Now, the BCCF, the big collective conjunctive fact, the problem that he wants to point out by using that, Pruss is saying that even if we accept that there is an infinite regress of contingent causes, each of those contingent causes would still need an explanation. And then basically the complete chain of these infinite regressive contingent causes is the BCCF. But that itself needs an explanation for itself. And of course, the problem then is if you accept it, then it explains everything except itself. And so it both proves itself and doesn't prove itself, right? Because it doesn't prove itself because there's one contingent fact that it doesn't explain its own existence, but it purports to be the explanation of all known contingent facts.
Yeah, for the Inwagen's argument, exactly.
Yeah, and that's where he introduces it as a way to undermine the Van Inwagen argument.
Right.
Now, you had said in a previous conversation we had that of those three premises, you could accept two of the three, but not all three. I think that premise one is not sufficiently proven. I think premise two is basically probably basic belief. And I think premise three, it may not be properly basic, but it's fairly intuitive.
Yeah, I mean, it is intuitive. Okay, so let me start back with basic one, right? The version of premise one that I actually liked over Inwagen's, which I think probably get you there as well, is just restating it to, if a proposition is a necessary proposition, then the explanation that it if it's a necessary proposition explaining something, then the explanation type must be conceptual. Right. I think that undermines it, because then you don't have to worry about necessary propositions explaining libertarian free choice, resolving to basically what's the word I'm looking for? Well, we don't have free will. Determinism. That's what I'm looking for. Right. And it's not scientific, because then you don't have to worry about that problem. So conceptual explanations would be necessary ones. So some would be, just not all of them. Like you said about how the premise is too strong. Then Inwagen's argument's fine, because when you invoke Q as an explanation for the BCCF, well, then it could be a conceptual explanation, and the contradiction basically gets rooted out at the source. So that basically, I think, just restating one to be something that most people might agree with anyway might save the BCCF anyway. Now, as far as the BCCF itself goes, one reason why I was thinking about it, I realize it's not quite intuitive as you might think, is this. If you start making a chain of contingent propositions, you start explaining them and throwing the explanations in, right? Some of the things you want to explain are going to be scientific, right? So at first you talk about how the universe is created mechanically. Say, Craig in the Kalam argument talks about the Big Bang. He talks about time tunneling and all these cool physical things. I'm not a physicist, so they're over my head just a bit. But he talks about all these cool physical processes which we can model, and we can, throw out one explanation over another one. So on all the steps leading up to the big one, the why anything at all explanation, you have basically libertarian when you're talking about people's choices, you have scientific when you're talking about mechanistic explanations for how the universe is, and then finally you get to the end, which is conceptual. But if at the very end of that you want an explanation for the whole conjunction there, your explanation has to explain every conjunct, and so the question then becomes, well, what kind of an explanation is it? Is it scientific? Is it libertarian? Or is it purely conceptual? Is it some of the three, none of the three, some two out of the three? I don't know. And that's one thing that strikes me against the BCCF as intuitive, because it's not clear what kinds of explanations we're talking about when we do it. And then that brings into question my restated premise one, right? We don't want necessary things explaining libertarian choices. We don't want necessary things potentially explaining scientific choices. But if the explanations are in part libertarian scientific, and we have an explanation that might be all three of the things, then it really becomes a problem.
Okay, a couple of points here. When you said the first premise of two necessary facts explaining a contingent fact, now, I think your solution's a pretty good one, because if you say that the necessary fact is a conceptual explanation, then one could just argue conceptually it's impossible for there to be two necessary facts that explain the same cause.
Yes.
And that way, and of course, like mathematics or logic, there wouldn't be anything necessarily untoward about that, because these concepts are very precise and rule out certain things. So if we could craft in such a way that I think you could, that would solve that. Now, the other point you had was, now what kind of an explanation is being considered in the BCCF, which is actually interesting, because I don't think Pruss actually uses that tripartite explanation system and then points back to the BCCF or BCCF star to see which explanation is involved. Now, since they're contingent facts, we would probably want to assume that agential and scientific explanations are implied, because given the limitations that we've given on one, it's quite likely that they're going to have to be, a good deal of those are going to have to be scientific and agential.
Right.
Now the question is, does any of those have to be necessary? I don't necessarily think it would have to be, because if the necessary fact is God, and God is a person, then the explanation would be agential, even though the agential cause is rooted in a necessary fact, i.e. the existence of God.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I think you could craft the BCCF in such a way that you wouldn't have to have a conceptual explanation. You could just limit it. You could just limit the set to scientific and agential, because the conceptual explanation would be God, but of course God gives rise to the agential cause of his choosing to create this or that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you think of that as a way to? I think that would probably save the BCCF.
Well, I mean, it might, but it seems to me that it seems like we're playing whack-a-mole. Like every time some interesting thing pops up, we kind of smack it down. We have to retune it, and something else is going to pop up, and we're smack it down and retune it, right? So in mathematics, right, there's a section of mathematics called topology, and in topology you talk about open sets, and you look at a topological space as a set of points, and you look at sets of points in that space, and you declare them to be open. Now, it's fine. It's a property of a topological space that any infinite union of sets must also be open. Or what that would mean is any, what's the word? So conjunctions are and in logic, but a statement of infinite ors, basically, right? An or, infinite or of a bunch of sets is open. We have no problem in math looking at infinite ors, but in topology, if you look at an infinite and of sets, an infinite conjunction of open sets, that's not necessarily open. And in fact, there's all kinds of examples where it might be closed, open, clopen, or neither. Now, I'm not up on my category theory enough to know if this infinite set problem is endemic to all categories containing these things. And if that is true, that if it is, if topology is kind of a canary in a coal mine, it might be that if you translate this over to categories and you look at the set of true propositions and sets of true propositions instead of the set of topological spaces, they might end up having the same systemic issues. So it occurs to me that what might be best for the argument is to avoid the BCCF entirely and do something else. So in math, we actually have these kind of problems, and we have tools to solve them. One of them is called Zorn's lemma. Have you ever heard of Zorn's lemma?
No, I haven't studied math or set theory the way you have. This is a little over my head right now.
Okay. Now, Zorn's lemma is really, really cool. Basically, what it does, we use this thing all the time in math to prove, for example, that every vector space, even including infinite dimensional ones, has a basis, or all sorts of other things. And so basically, it deals with infinite regresses, and it kind of ties them in a bow in exactly the way we want to here. So how a Zorn's lemma style argument might work for this PSR argument is this. Start with any seed, any single thing you want to explain, any cool contingent fact, right? If you start with the beginning of the universe itself, if you kind of start at the end, that might be viewed as cheating. So start close to the middle, right? Start with like the Big Bang or a biogenesis, if a biogenesis is supposedly a thing, right? Start with one of those cool facts that are big, that need explanations. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, that explanation is one of two things. It's either necessary or it's contingent, right? You throw the contingent explanations in the set. And so as far as people keep insisting you have contingent explanations, you throw them in a set. And what you do is you use set inclusion to form what's called a chain. A chain is kind of like you look at a chain is a collection of values where any two of them you can look at one and say it's greater than or less than the other one. So as far as set inclusion goes, you look at two sets and you say one must be a subset of the other one. And this is easy to do in the chain we're forming because all we're doing is starting with a seeded fact and adding on explanations. And you can just count the number of elements in the set and say, oh, well, one has more than the other one. They're constructed by the same way, so we know which is bigger. Now, what Zorn's lemma says is, let me get up the exact formulation of Zorn's lemma here, because I think you're going to like this. All right, so Zorn's lemma says, suppose a partially ordered set has the property that every chain in it has an upper bound in that set. Then the set contains at least one maximal element. So if you take P, your big set, to be the set of all, I don't know, logically true propositions or something general for the moment. And what you do is you build an arbitrary chain by starting with a fact you want to explain, an observable thing, and tacking on explanations until you build this chain. And if you can deduce that every chain has an upper bound, then the set will contain the maximal element. And that maximal element is going to be closer to what you're trying to build. And it doesn't have all the problems that the BCCF has as far as tacking on an infinite conjunct. So my philosophy with the PSR is that I think you can use more sophisticated ways of dealing with the BCCF infinite regress problem without just stamping on the BCCF. I think there's going to be more problems to that thing than it solves, but I think the argument itself can hold if you just use more sophisticated structures. What do you think about that?
So basically, it sounds like from what you're saying is, given, because you've studied set theory, the idea that you have to define a set very specifically. And
Right.
You seem to be saying that Pruss has not been as precise in the definition of the set of the BCCF as you'd like.
I don't think it can be, given its nature.
Well, another problem with sets is, of course, is Kurt Gödel. You know, he sort of torpedoed classical foundationalism with his views of set theory.
Yes.
So, yeah, sets are basically, Russell wanted to have a self-contained set that explained everything. And then Gödel says, well, sorry, can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems almost that the BCCF is trying to be classically foundationalist in that regard, and having a set that contains everything.
Yeah. Well, yeah. At least all contingent propositions. Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, basically, as far as I can tell, it seems like you're saying, well, you're not necessarily evoking Gödel, but it's kind of the same idea. It's like that kind of a set is imprecise.
It is. It's too big, and I think for the argument, you don't even need it to be big, because what you're trying to do is start with one thing you're explaining, and build an infinite regression chain of explanations, and you're trying to see if that chain stops somewhere. And so Zorn's lemma basically is exactly the structure of the argument that you're trying to make anyway, but you're not throwing in so much extra stuff that you're trying to that you might end up crashing the system and running into all kinds of logical problems. So I think the argument's salvageable, and I like it. I just don't quite like the BCCF personally.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is we need a smaller set with more precise terms that might produce the same logical conundrum for the Van Inwagen argument, but in a way that doesn't have any of the baggage of the BCCF or BCCF star.
Sure, and if you define the set that way, then you, again, don't even get the contradiction in the Inwagen argument, because what Inwagen argument says is let Q be an explanation for the BCCF. By premise one, it's contingent. That's questionable. But even assuming the explanation is conceptual, right? Let Q be a conceptual explanation. Well, then we have the problem again. Or no, let Q be an agential or scientific explanation. Well, then it can't be necessary, then it's contingent, then it goes in the BCCF. Why? Because the BCCF contains every contingent explanation. But if you're careful in how you define it, the BCCF won't contain every single contingent fact, and therefore you can do more interesting things with it.
Yeah, okay. Now on your sheet here, the next thing you get into is the actual argument for the existence of God. Premise one, every contingent fact has an explanation. God is the only possible explanation for the conjunction of all contingent facts. Therefore, God exists. Now, what are some of your problems with that formulation, or that? Yeah.
Oh, nothing. Especially not mine. This again was talking about. This section of my paper was talking about my question as to what kind of an explanation would the BCCF be. So what the naturalists might say is. Oh, no, I see what's going on here. Hold on. Right, I see. Yeah. So this had to do with the explanations. So if you assume the explanation is purely explanation, sorry, my brain is going haywire here for a second. If you assume your necessary explanation must be conceptual, part of this thing is it's word salad, it's a tongue twister. Then I've seen naturalistic objections to other types of arguments of this form, where they'll say, what you've done here is you've declared that only one type of explanation can exist for this one thing, and it must be God, therefore God exists. And what the naturalists are opposed to for this argument, I've actually done a lot of research looking at quote-unquote refutations to the Kalam cosmological argument, is this idea that you've defined the premises in such a way that only God can be the answer to them a priori, and therefore God is the only thing that solves the argument a priori. So what you're talking about here, I think, in this section of the paper is where I say naturalists, depending on how you resolve the BCCF question of what kind of explanation is God, they might see this as, every contingent fact has an explanation. God is the only possible explanation for the conjunction of all contingent facts, or however we define it. Therefore, God exists. And they might object, the version of this objection comes from the fact that God is being slid kind of in the premise itself. And so they might see the argument as sort of circular. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, because depending on how you deal with either one or the BCCF like we talked about, this objection isn't really an objection. I
would argue, just not to belabor the point, but
yeah,
that it isn't really question begging, because part of the problem is the at least less sophisticated skeptics who criticize this position, is given the nature of ontology, the argument is the only being that could satisfy all these conditions is the being that we would otherwise call God.
Right. Well, yeah. I think
Which isn't really question begging. I mean, you don't have to craft it that way. I think it's partly a misunderstanding, because if it's a necessary fact, then, well, I think there's only one of them, but we'll get into the fact about polytheism later. But
right, yeah, exactly. So what they say is you have a necessary fact explaining this contingent proposition, right? And so you have a set of possible necessary facts which could explain this BCCF, or whatever its formulation may look like. And what I've seen some of them try to argue is, well, why can't you invoke a set of possible necessary explanations for this thing, and then, whittle it down until you have the godlike necessary explanations? So I think that's more their claim, but I'm going to let them fight that battle, because my intuition is that depending on how you deal with the no necessary explanation for contingent facts premise, or the BCCF, if you handle those in the right way, the refutation, quote unquote, handles itself before you even have to do anything. So I'm not too worried about it.
yeah, did you want to go in at this point now to the possible unary or multiple nature of the necessary fact?
Yeah. So let's transfer over to the gap argument, because there's two basic questions I have about this article. The first is just the logical structure of it, which I think we've talked about at length. The second question I have is the gap argument, and this is where I get frustrated with Christian apologetics in general. As a non-Christian, I'm more of a deist. I have some Platonic leanings, but mostly deism. And the idea is you have these very good abstract arguments for God existence that work, in a vacuum. You have the ontological argument, you've got the PSR argument, you've got all sorts of cool arguments that advocate for some necessary being very, very well. But then what happens is you have these gap arguments that say, well, we can now prove that God has, he's all powerful, or he's all good, or he has agency, or he has, X, Y, and Z. And oftentimes those arguments look good on their own. And the first argument looks good on its own. But I never see Christian apologetics in this vein go through and evaluate the gap arguments in terms of the structure of the argument already presented. And that usually raises a lot of questions that I don't see answered. So in this particular paper, let's look at the fact that God has agency. That's proved in the gap argument. But it's the repercussions of that argument aren't examined in terms of the PSR. So as you even said earlier, ultimately, the explanation for the set of all contingent facts, the universe, whatever, is going to ultimately be agential, because God causes it. Mm-hmm. However, if God has agency, that means he has some form of free will, where he's not like a computer. His choices aren't just given out in front of him and he just follows a subroutine. But rather, he could choose to do X rather than Y. Well, if he could choose to do X rather than Y, it's possible that it is either one, and therefore his choices are contingent. So, but if God's choices are now contingent facts, now we have to hit them with the PSR once again, and we say they must have an explanation. So what must the explanation look like? Well, if the explanation is contingent, that would be silly, because God's supposed to be the necessary thing that transcends contingent things. But if the explanation is necessary, or if it is contingent, let's say, you can shove it into the BCCF and find something else. So ultimately, it's going to have to be necessary to cut off the second regress that would form from a set of contingent explanations for God's choices. So we can just cut the chase and say we're looking at necessary things explaining God's agency. Well, these necessary properties have to be interior or exterior to God. Well, if you have necessary things that are exterior to God, that brings up the polytheism question, because well, for obvious reasons, you have these now we have these two necessary beings both contending for God's status. One is the explanation for choices that the other one makes, which, how else would you model that out, as far as, two gods having some sort of say into each other's actions, or more, or whatever. The other way to deal with it is you have the necessary property being intrinsic to God. So, what kind of questions does that raise? Well, there's the obvious one, where God doesn't have agency at all, and there's actually some necessary property of God, which I think you've said is divine simplicity. There's some necessary part of God's essence that basically determines everything God's going to do. The other way of resolving it is, I believe, the discussion that we had, where you say that there might be several necessary agential beings, intrinsic to God as a system, and the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit would be, the Christian explanation for this. And the choices of any one of the three beings can be explained by the necessary existence of the other two as collaborators. Does that sound about right as far as our explanation went?
That seems pretty close.
Yeah, from a logical standpoint.
Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and finish, but yeah, it sounds good on top of it.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, there's going to be some theological differences coming up in Christian theology, but the logical structure is basically what I'm getting at here. Now, the question I had with with the latter one is, if these three beings are all agents making different choices, right? They collaborate, but the question rises, can one make a choice that the other two wouldn't like? So if we explain the choices based on the necessary existence of the other beings, well, you could explain it as doing something they would like as collaborators, or you could explain it as one of the three beings doing something the other two wouldn't like. Maybe they made him mad or something like that happened. And so the next question is, can one make a choice that's antithetical to the other two because there might be some kind of a schism or something like that? And if the answer is no, well, then that means they're all working in perfect tandem. Well, perfect tandem with what? And I think we talked about this a while ago, and I think the explanation you gave me, and you probably have to take over this, the explanation you gave me went something like, they all draw their thoughts from the mind of God somewhere. So the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, well, the Father is himself, and he has the mind of God. But the Son and the Holy Spirit, as you described it, kind of pull their thoughts and ideas from that collective mind. So that basically precludes them making choices that go in conflict with each other. Is that about right? This was confusing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's stop here at the moment. There's a lot of questions within the gap that you're talking about. So let's to keep track of them and answer them in order. Let's bring up the first one. What was the first objection you had with the gap problem in this particular article? Let's just do them one at a time.
Oh. Well, I basically went through it. It's just kind of like a process, right?
Yeah, but I mean, each step. Let's deal with each step at a time because there's a lot of steps you went through.
Oh, there is. Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. Yes, if God has agency, then God could choose to do X or Y. And actually, Pruss makes a good point in his section about libertarian free will. Most of the time when Pruss is talking about explanations, he's saying it's unreasonable that an explanation has to assume X and Y not Y, right? Or let's say P and Q. The explanation doesn't have to explain why P happened, but Q didn't happen. And he's very, very consistent with that all throughout the article until he gets to libertarian free will, in which he has a higher standard. If libertarian free will is true, then your choices are contingent, and therefore you have to explain why you did X instead of not X, because it has to be possible you did one and not for something to be contingent means it's possibly true or possibly false. So you have to explain why some choice and why not some other choice when you have two possible choices in front of you.
Okay. That's the first step. So
yeah.
Now you're arguing that he gives basically two separate, one weaker, one stronger, demand for explaining why choosing one choice over another. There's the weaker form that he starts off with, you're saying, and then when he gets to libertarian free will, he goes to a harder one.
Right, and I'm happy to accept it. Yeah.
Well, okay, I would tend to argue in that case. So, for instance, right, one would argue that Adam and Eve had libertarian free will; they could choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or choose not to.
Right.
But of course, the one choice would be an evil choice. So, what I'd say is, God is constrained by his nature. So I guess in that sense, he can't have libertarian free will because he cannot, the full range of possible choices that we have, he doesn't have.
Right.
But that's not a defect, as a lot of people might think it is. So I don't know. I mean, there's still a range of freedom, right? We can define freedom in various ways, right? There's the idea that all of our actions are determined. We have no freedom. Some of our actions are determined and some aren't.
Right.
and then none of our actions are determined, which I guess would be the opposite extreme. Whereas I think that we could say that, and even within the middle term, that some of our actions are restricted and others are not. There's variations of degrees within that even too, like how much are they controlled, how much are free. I would argue that humans have of course more quote unquote choice than God does, because humans can choose to do things that God cannot choose to do, because God by his nature is unable to choose those things, like to lie or to steal or to murder or to do any of these things that we can choose to do. And in fact, we could choose to fall, but God can't. So in that sense, I don't think the strong libertarian free will benchmark that he gives is necessarily relevant to God's choices. I think because you seem to think that the weaker justification for why A not B is still good, but you think that when he makes it the bar higher for libertarian free will, then it becomes more problematic within the context of God.
Well, more specifically, basically because I have Platonic leanings, I consider the universe itself as a necessarily existent thing. I think that I see God as basically the ontologically perfect representation of all his qualities. And I don't mean like his actions. Like if God could do any action, he must do every possible iteration of that action. I just mean if God has it in him to be a creator, then God must always have created something. It's a contradiction to imagine God not having done something. So, for example, I don't like the idea that in the beginning there was nothing, but there was God, and then later God decided to create. Well, if God has it in him ontologically to create, then there must be some sort of duality of God and matter. And so that's basically my structure here. So when you get to the question of, if in the beginning there was nothing, for example, it's certainly not violating God's nature to have nothing existing, because there was nothing and there was God for quite a while. God's a timeless being. And it doesn't violate God's nature to create a universe. So, because he's done it, apparently, he's created a universe. So neither of those two choices conflict with God's nature. So even accounting for God's nature, now we still have the can God do X or do Y, or, why was there no universe? And then suddenly there was one, kind of a thing,
Yeah, so the question it seems like you're asking here is, God could choose not to create, and that would be perfectly consistent with logic in his nature. He could choose to create. That would also be perfectly consistent with his logic and his nature. Well, let me give you something somewhat analogous. Human beings have a range of potentialities. We could choose to do or not to do something. So, for instance, all humans, most humans, assuming they don't have any birth defects, have the ability to procreate.
Sure.
Now, at one point, those that usually do at one point weren't doing it before, but at some point they choose to do so. Some never choose to do so. But those that do choose to do so, at one point were not doing it and then chose to do it. Now, the fact that they had the potential to procreate but doesn't produce any sort of logical conundrum. And since we are made in the image of God, this is pretty an analogy, but I would argue that the problem is not that God didn't create before time t, whatever time t is, but I think your question is, why did he choose to do it at some point in time? Of course, he's timeless, so it's still analogous.
Right.
I would argue that, well, I guess in a similar way that humans do.
Okay, my question about that, though, is humans, right? We can explain the libertarian choices of human beings, assuming we're not going into either biological determinism or, divine determinism. If we want to take the libertarian, idea, we can explain humans' choices as an interaction with other contingent beings, right? Maybe I want to procreate, but I can't afford rent right now, and I can't afford to raise a child, and so I'll wait until I get a better job. Or maybe I have to find a mate before I procreate, but I'm too busy with school and work or whatever to look for a mate, and so I haven't found one. And so you can always explain those using, other contingent facts within our global system. However, if there was a God with no universe or anything else, then the only thing you could have to explain why there was nothing is within God himself, because he's the only other thing that is according to this model. And so I don't think that explanation quite holds even metaphorically.
Okay, well, this is where we get to the nature of God. Is God a monad, or is God a trinity?
Exactly.
if God is a monad, like it seems to be Islam, deism, Platonism, and Judaism seem to imply, then that would be a problem, because there's just one person, one agent, and then God's nature, and that's it. Classically, in the Christian conception, we have the Trinity, where the Father eternally begets the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so if we have three human beings, right, humans, their choices can be limited in a couple of ways, right? They're limited by the material means.
Right.
But of course we can rule that out, because God doesn't have those limitations. Limited by nature, which God would still have. And then, of course, depending on the kind of result we would like to get out of another person, we are going to have to then decide which choice we do maximizes the desired outcome of the person, and that would be the motivation for y over x, or yx over y.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I would say that from eternity past, we have this eternal procession of Son and Spirit from the Father. So we had three persons, and so these three persons, the choice that the one person makes is in part conditioned by the other two persons, in much the same way that if I'm in a threesome, the choice I make would be conditioned in part on the reaction, well, A, the reaction of the other two persons, and then B, the desired result that I'd like to get from the other two persons, or even the other one person, because I still might have to think about the third person to get the response I want from the one person.
Yeah, so I have a question about that. Yeah, so I remember a previous conversation. I think you tried to describe the Holy Spirit as an emanation of God. So, for example, if God is the candle flame, the Holy Spirit would be like the heat that emanates from the candle. I think that was closer to the metaphor you used. Is that about right?
Yeah, the metaphor is that God the Father is the candle, God the Son is the flame, and the Holy Spirit is the light that radiates out of it.
Okay, so if the Holy Spirit is a light that radiates out of the being of the conjoined being, as the metaphor holds, of God the Father and God the Son, then it seems like any choice the Father or the Son would make would by default have to be okay with the Holy Spirit, because it's kind of derivative of the other two.
Okay, I think you mentioned this earlier in the conversation. One of the things that you're talking about is, okay, if they all have three independent wills, but three discrete wills,
Yeah.
but then all act in unison, how is that not one will?
Exactly.
Now, the analogy that I would give, and this is the one based off of what Christ gives, be ye one as I and the Father are one. Now, of course, Christ cannot mean a unary oneness of modality, because, of course, we're all independent human beings of discrete body and mind. But we can conceive of a perfect human nature where individuals, I mean, we see this all the time in socialism, and they just get human nature wrong. But these people of perfect human nature all freely choose to act in the public good, and they all act with one will, in the sense that they're all acting for the same objectives, and that they wouldn't contradict one another. So we can imagine, like in utopian socialist fiction, these individuals that are acting in unison for a common purpose. And usually in these utopian socialist novels, the breakdown, at least for me, is not that they're all acting in unison, but that the means by which humanity is redeemed. Like somehow these perfect, nice people that always act in unison for the same common goals. But how does that happen? They just wave their magic wand of equality and it somehow happens. That's, to me, where the utopian socialist novels break down. Not so much that you could have a world where all these humans act with one accord to this purpose. And I would say that the idea, let me put it this way, that you have independent wills all acting in unison is not a contradiction. No contradiction arises.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But using your metaphor, there's if you look at the goal itself of, say, the people acting in unison, right? That goal has an explanation. So, for example, in the socialist utopia, we're all human beings. We all got to not starve to death. We all need to live in shelter. We probably want some technological advancement. We probably want a whole bunch of, there's a whole set of, a checklist of, contingent facts, which explain which explain what they're trying to maximize. They're trying to maximize the utility, the pleasure, survival of everybody. They're trying to make good on this checklist of contingent facts, and that then derives the goal that they're acting towards. But even if I use the metaphor, the goal that the three would be acting towards isn't explainable by any contingent fact in the same way. So what drives their goal?
Well, yeah, of course, whatever goal they're aiming for would not be a contingent fact. It would be a non-contingent fact.
Right.
The goal within classical theism is that the glory of the Father.
Yes.
So all three members of the Trinity are when they perform actions, are acting under in accordance with this overriding umbrella of agreed upon purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Which of course is a non-contingent fact. And I think what you're probably going to say then is, well, if it's a non-contingent fact and they're all acting under this rubric, how then are their choices themselves not determined, and therefore the creation of the universe not determined, therefore everything we do not determined?
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to go quite that far. I mean, close, but I was going to say this, here's something that I'm going to get to in the teleological argument if we ever get to talking about that article. This idea that, okay, so God created the universe to maximize his glory, right? Everything the three work for is to maximize glory in the same way that a socialist utopia would maximize, the contingent, worldly things. So that begs a question then. The universe that was built, it seems to me that that universe that was built is the maximum of God's glory. It's the maximum, so all the people in it, the way it was built, all that stuff. So I'm not going to get into determinism of the beings within the universe, but the material universe itself, just the basic byproduct of that. Seems like if God's going to maximize his utility, necessarily this had to happen. Otherwise something else would have happened, because God would have found some other way to maximize his glory, his utility in glory. So it seems to, at least to me, reinforce some kind of weak Platonic dualism, because God's here. He wanted to maximize his glory. Here's the universe that apparently did it. And therefore, I can't see God not doing it, because not doing so would give him less glory than doing otherwise. You see what I'm saying?
I think let me explain back to you what I think you're saying. You can tell
Sure.
me if that's what you're saying or not. Basically, the world that we have now, with all of its current defects, is a world God created. And so if we go back to possible worlds, if God could have created a world where the fall didn't happen, then that would be more maximally glorifying, but he didn't do that. Therefore, that's just maybe logically not on the table. And something like this world was the one that was made, and therefore we have this innate propensity to some sort of error or sin.
Oh, I'm not even going quite that theological.
You're not going there, okay?
Yeah, I'm just talking about there's just the material properties for the moment. Just maybe as far as the beings in the world themselves, like human beings, crocodiles, kangaroos, whatever. Even if some people like to argue that God created things and then they evolved because they were created to do such, just everything that was created at time zero in the way it was created, I argue, it doesn't seem that it could have been created any other way. Now, original sin and the nature of man as choice makers and all that stuff, I consider that a different question, because, if God created man with free will to maximize his glory under this construct, as Christians see it, then I don't think there's any contradiction as far as the fall and anything else like that goes. Really, I'm just talking more metaphysical dualism. The world as it is must have always been, in the sense that, God couldn't have created otherwise.
Yeah, okay. I think what you're getting at, because you sort of segued into this with the teleological argument. Maybe one thing that I could say that could help narrow or clarify this is the problem of dysteleology, which is the result of the fall. The world, when it was created, was perfect and was maximally glorifying to God. So he didn't have to create a world with dysteleology in it. The world, we happen to have dysteleology as a result of the choices of free agents.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I'm getting closer to what you're trying to get at, but it feels like you brought in teleology for a reason. And
Yeah, the third article in the teleological argument in the Natural Companion, or the Blackwell Companion, is talking about probabilities and the fine-tuning constants of the universe and all that kind of a deal, right? It's so improbable that the universe was created by random chance because you have X, Y, and Z. But what I'm doing is I'm kind of short-circuiting that argument by saying, well, look, if even under the Christian model, if God could have created a different world with different constants, he might have done it. And so I think the whole argument is short-circuited the fact that the world as it is, with the constants that are and all that, you know, abstract stuff within it, was the thing that maximized God's glory in the beginning, and therefore it couldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah, I guess one of the things you'd have to consider is, are there multiple worlds, multiple possible worlds with different constants that, if you look at each one discretely, equally maximally achieve God's glory?
That's a good question.
So if you have multiple worlds, multiple possible worlds that God could have chosen to create, that all of them maximally raise His glory, then there would have to, you could then argue there's some other, because basically when I said that God's glory is one facet, I didn't want to imply that it's the only rubric or facet under which God chooses.
Oh, sure.
And so if we have multiple governing beliefs for the Trinity, of choosing action, choosing between actions, then of course we have to have a hierarchy of actions, and we have to then weigh each cause for this one. It feels like the objection you're raising has more power if we assume a more unary motivation rather than a plural motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we posit, I think as a Christian, you can't posit other plural motivations. For instance, the Orthodox Christians talk about God's overflowing of love. Because of his self-giving nature, he's like a. Let me give you a distinction. When I took medieval philosophy, the scholastic tradition taught that God created the universe gratis, at a sort of a gratuitous act of the will, which of course sounds very nominalistic, doesn't it? It's just this act of the will. Sounds almost existentialist, right? Whereas the Orthodox view it as God's love is like a liquid in a cup, and it's overflowing. It just overflows the cup, and that overflow is the act of creation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too keen on the idea of a gratuitous creation because it sounds very existentialist and seems to be somewhat nominalist almost. It's just an act of the will for the sake of the will or whatever.
Right.
Because that's the impression I certainly got when I studied at college. But if we look at it this way, as that would be the Eastern way. It's another motivating principle for God to act. So I guess I would challenge the point that there's only one possible world in which God could maximize his glory. There could be more than one possible world, and in which case why he chose this one over another would be another judgment factor, another question. So I would argue, I haven't thought about all the possible motivations for God to act, but that's one of the big ones. I would argue there's a range of derivative facts about God's nature that govern God's choices. So God's nature governs his choices, and there's a range of aspects to his nature that govern those choices. And then there's sort of a web of governing principles that when the Godhead acts, it navigates through those principles.
Okay. So, I mean, after listening to this, I guess my follow-up question is, so if a deist were to posit a God, say, without agency, and you posit a God basically whose choices are driven by a hierarchy of maximal things, basically, that I mean, what's the difference in the model there? Because the way I see it, you know, God has all these properties, he min-maxes them like a computer might, in the way you're describing him, or the Trinity itself. They min-max it like a computer might, and then, you know, out comes the outcome, you know, whether it be universes or worlds or edicts or, you know, whatever else the angels do. That seems to be the model, whereas the deists basically, I don't think there's a fundamental disagreement there when they say God is like a computer and it's a force that just does what it does. So where do you think the difference lies between those two ideas?
Well, actually, you brought up a good point, because maybe maybe this is something that I misunderstood you saying, because when we look at the PSR, it's trying to explain why we choose one thing over another.
Sure.
Whereas now you and I both tend to argue that the utility maximizing calculator model of neoliberal economics is inadequate. So I don't want to give the impression that God is a utility maximizing calculator when he makes choices.
Right.
It may have appeared that way. That was not the impression I was intending to give. But it's just that in a way analogous to how a human would make the same choices, he would, of course, do it faster, more perfectly, because he lacks our defects, and he's God, so he can think much more quickly than we can. But I would say the key problem with deism vis-a-vis the Trinity is, now you would argue that God is an agent, right, as a deist?
I don't. Well, I'm trying to do so seems to be getting me into more questions than it answers, and so I'm kind of a minimalist as far as assumptions go. And so unless there's a specific theorem or corollary or something, I'd need that aspect of God to demonstrate in my metaphysics. I guess I just don't assume it. I don't refute it, but I just don't assume it in my construction.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to some extent the deist does have to imply that God is a person, because God did create. So he's not like a Platonic monad or anything. No, I mean, because a Platonic monad is an eternal emanation.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you accept that, or do you accept the deist special creation? Because there were deists that believed in special creation.
Well, here's the thing. Like, I guess I'm more in tune with emanation, because the first thing I brought up before, where if there was nothing, we now have to explain every instance of why there was nothing, given that we know something would have been a better maximizer of God's utility, and not utility, glory, and all the other aspects of God. And so trying to knowing that the way this is, even under the Christian model, is currently maximizing God's glory and everything else that he cares about, it doesn't seem to me that we can imagine God with nothing, because we know nothing didn't cut it.
Yeah, okay. The reason why I would argue that, okay, this is the key question here.
Yeah.
So you would either, there's two ways you could look at this, right? Either God is wholly, God of the universe are identical, that's pantheism, and then there's Spinoza's panentheism, where the God is not reducible to all the parts of the universe, but the universe has no parts, it's not a part of God. In the other case, you have an emanation view of God of the universe. So God is wholly immanent in that regard, right? Immanent is being in the universe, transcendent is being outside of the universe. The problem with that kind of a deism, or Platonism, I would argue, is that this actually has nothing to do with the PSR, but with the Kalam cosmological argument, and we might want to save hashing this out for a little bit later. But the problem is, a finite effect cannot be the result of a infinite cause unless that infinite cause is agential. Because that effect would, if the cause is conceptual or scientific, then it would have to be always the case. Therefore, an eternal cause would always the case produce this effect. But as we know, the universe began to exist some finite point in time ago. So therefore, the only explanation left is agential, which would mean that the God would have to be an agent, because we know the universe can't be eternal.
Well, we know this universe is finite. I guess my model more supposes that there can't be God without some existing set of matter.
Oh,
now,
okay.
The nature of the matter might change through processes and other things, but I can't imagine God without matter.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. To me, the question, I'm having a hard time understanding why that's a problem, or how that problem is expressed in the question, because from my position, I don't find that a problem, because from the Christian perspective, we teach that there was nothing for a very long time besides the existence of God himself.
Right. And that's where the PSR comes into play, because if there was nothing and God could have created, then at every instance where there's God and there's nothing, God chose to create nothing. And so that choice needs an explanation. But we already know that God choosing to create something has an explanation, as far as, helping God do the things he cares about, love, glory, all the things you mentioned there. Mm-hmm. So any instance in which there's God and nothing, God is not doing the thing that God wants to do. And there's no outside reason for God not to do it, like for us in procreation, as far as we can't pay bills, we can't afford kids. God doesn't have money he has to save up before he can build a universe, kind of a thing, right? So there's nothing getting in the way of God in something.
Okay, yeah, okay. The 2 points need to be brought up here. From whatever monotheistic tradition we're coming from,
Sure.
the actual motivation that God or the monad used, we can never know. At least
Yes.
not
Right.
this side of the grave, anyhow.
Absolutely.
So that's not actually the question.
No.
I think what I would argue is this, though. Okay, I could choose. I mean, it would be a motivation. There's many things that I could do, and I just choose not to do them because I don't want to. I don't maybe feel the need to at the moment. I'm not really restrained by anything necessarily. No physical conditions necessarily. I mean, why read a book or play a video game? I mean, right? If you have the time to do either, and you have
Right.
no outstanding reasons to do one or the other, it's
Sure.
kind of just whatever you feel like doing in the moment, kind of thing.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, we as mortals are constrained by the fact that we have to do one action or another action. And so we choose
God is
to
not
do something in favor. Exactly.
Well, he is and he isn't.
Oh, okay.
I mean, when God chooses to, because then we get to Jesus, and that gets a little complicated, because
Absolutely. Yeah.
in that sense he was constrained, right? But I mean, would he be constrained before time? I mean, by his nature he would be. In that sense he would be constrained. I guess I just feel like the fact that if I were to say that, given the multiple non-nature contradictory actions God could perform, the fact that for whatever reason he chose for eternity past not to create the universe, and then for whatever reason at time t at the beginning of the universe he chose to create it, I don't see any logical contradiction arising from there, because I think we could easily assume some nature-bound motivation for not doing it, but we just will never be able to know this side of the grave.
Right, and that's all a PSR demands, that there is some explanation. But Pruss said, naive, and I agree with that. We don't necessarily have to understand the explanation to know that there is one. And so that's basically where my objection sits. And it's not even an objection. Like I said, more of this is more a frustration with the apologetic arguments, and that they compartmentalize the arguments. I would really have preferred that, I don't know, a whole third of this this article was probably ripped out, as far as explaining why the PSR is necessary and, really basic things. He spent a whole bunch of time talking about what he means by modality. I don't see why he had to do that sort of thing. And I would have preferred him just talking about agency, because that's the only gap argument that really conflicts the PSR is agency, because that's where you get things involving explanations. And just talk about how what he argued about agency sticks and is explained by what he argued previously with the PSR. I think doing that would have just made his argument a whole lot stronger.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a poor substitute for Craig or Pruss, but you're right, though. There does seem to be this tendency where they don't put the two separate arguments together and see how they mesh.
Yeah, and that's my only major gripe.
I mean, there probably is a way to do it. It's just like I would have to agree with you with it. At the moment, we haven't seen a lot of literature doing that. I wonder if, at least in our point in time, it's the case because each independent thread had not been sufficiently developed yet, and they spent all of their effort developing these two independent threads. And at some point, when the body of philosophical work is to the point where those two threads are completed, then tying them together will be the next philosophical problem to be solved on the horizon.
I hope that is the case. I hope that I see something like that soon.
Because I mean, I can't say for sure, but my guess is the reason why it's two ships in the night is because it takes so much effort to argue for each of the two ships, if you will.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of work that needed to be done that hadn't been done yet, and it just took up all their effort. I would recommend. Now, I don't know if Pruss answers questions, but I know you've mentioned some gap arguments with Craig and the Kalam argument. Like I said, you should write into Craig. Maybe he'll respond. He's been known to respond to people on his website.
Sure, absolutely.
So we've been going a little over. We've been going about an hour. Maybe we should wrap it up. It's been an interesting conversation, though. Is there anything else you want to add, or are you satisfied with where we left off?
No, I'm pretty satisfied. Hopefully your regular viewers found this as interesting as I did.
Yeah, I hope so too. Well, thanks again, Matt, for coming on. This is Todd Lewis of The Praise of Folly, signing off.